The great hall was filled with noise before the meeting began. Powerful men and women, dressed in sharp suits and expensive jewelry, spoke loudly to each other. They laughed, they argued, they compared their wealth and ideas. These were not ordinary people. They were business leaders, scientists, politicians, and thinkers from across the nation. Each one believed they were among the best minds of their time. But when the heavy wooden doors closed, silence fell. At the far end of the room, on a high platform, the Tycoon entered. Everyone turned their heads toward him. He was a tall man with silver hair and eyes sharp like steel. He was known across the country as the man who built an empire out of nothing. He had more money than most nations. His words could shake the stock market. His decisions could change the lives of millions. People called him the Titan of industry. Others simply called him Sir. Yet there was something unusual about this gathering. The Tycoon had not invited them to talk about business, politics, or money. He had called them here for a challenge, a question. One question that no one had been able to answer. He stepped forward slowly, resting both hands on the wooden podium. His voice cut through the silence, calm but heavy. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you have been chosen because you are the brightest minds I could find. Some of you are inventors. Some of you are leaders. Some of you are masters of science, of law, of finance. And yet..." He paused. His eyes scanned the room. No one moved. "And yet, I have a question that none of my advisors, none of my partners, and none of my rivals have been able to answer." A murmur spread across the room. The brightest minds in the hall leaned forward, eager. The Tycoon raised a hand for silence. "This question is not about money," he continued. "It is not about power. It is not about business or politics. It is something deeper, something more important. And today, I want to see if anyone here has the courage and the wisdom to answer it." The hall grew still. Outside the windows, the city was alive with light, but inside the hall there was only silence. People waited, almost holding their breath. Finally, the Tycoon spoke the question. "What is the one thing," he asked slowly, "that all my wealth cannot buy, all my power cannot command, and all my knowledge cannot solve?" His words echoed in the air. For a moment, no one spoke. The question seemed simple, but it carried weight, like a mountain on their shoulders. The richest banker in the room cleared his throat and stood. "Sir, perhaps the answer is time. Even with your billions, you cannot buy more days." The Tycoon shook his head. "No. Wrong." The banker sat down, embarrassed. A scientist stood next. "It must be truth. Money can twist facts, but truth remains beyond control." "Wrong," the Tycoon said again, sharper this time. One by one, people rose with answers. Love. Respect. Peace. Death. Each one spoke with confidence. Each one failed. The Tycoon dismissed them all with a wave of his hand. Frustration began to grow in the room. These were people used to being right, used to being praised. Now, every answer fell flat, and the Tycoon grew colder with every attempt. At the back of the hall, a quiet figure pushed his broom across the floor. The janitor. He was not part of the meeting. He wore no suit, no tie, only a simple gray uniform. His hands were rough from work, his shoulders bent from years of sweeping floors and carrying buckets. He moved slowly, carefully, trying not to disturb the gathering. But as he swept, his ears caught every word. The experts argued. The leaders tried. The scholars failed. The Tycoon grew angry. And all the while, the janitor kept sweeping, listening quietly. Minutes stretched into an hour. The hall grew hot with tension. Some people whispered that maybe the Tycoon's question had no answer at all. Others thought it was a trick. Finally, the Tycoon slammed his hand against the podium. "Enough," he shouted. His voice boomed like thunder. "Is there truly no one here who can answer me? Not one among you?" The hall fell into silence. No one dared to speak now. heads lowered in shame. And then, the sound of the broom stopped. The janitor had paused. He leaned on the broom, his face partly hidden in the shadow of the hall. For the first time, his eyes lifted toward the stage. No one noticed him at first. He was just a worker, invisible to those who thought themselves important. But the Tycoon's eyes, sharp and restless, caught the movement. Their eyes met across the room. The Tycoon frowned. "What about you?" he said suddenly. His voice carried to the back of the hall. Everyone turned in shock. "The janitor," someone whispered. Laughter broke out. "Surely not him. He is not a scholar. What could he know?" But the Tycoon raised his hand for silence. His eyes stayed on the janitor. "You," he repeated. "Do you have an answer?" The janitor stood very still. His heart pounded in his chest. For years, he had been invisible. For years, no one had asked his opinion. He was the man who cleaned their floors, emptied their trash, fixed their lights. To them, he was nothing. And yet, now, all eyes were on him. Slowly, he stepped forward, broom in hand. The hall grew strangely quiet. The laughter died. The whispers faded. Something in his calm step silenced even the proudest voices. He walked until he stood at the edge of the great hall, looking up at the Tycoon. For the first time in years, the janitor spoke. His voice was steady, low, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I think," he said, "I know the answer." Gasps filled the hall. The impossible had happened. The room of great leaders, thinkers, and experts all defeated. And now, the man no one respected, the man no one noticed, claimed he could answer. The Tycoon's eyes narrowed. For the first time that night, there was a hint of curiosity in his cold expression. "Then speak," the Tycoon said. "Tell us. What is the answer that no one else could give?" The janitor gripped his broom tighter. His eyes did not waver. He took a deep breath. And just as the first words left his mouth, the lights flickered. The hall shook with a sudden rumble, as if the building itself held its breath. The silence was so heavy it felt alive. Every person leaned forward. What would he say? The room was holding its breath. All eyes were fixed on the janitor, the man no one had ever noticed before. He had just said the impossible words, he believed he knew the answer. For a heartbeat, silence ruled the grand hall. Then came the laughter. It started with a soft chuckle from one of the wealthy bankers, then grew into waves of mockery across the room. Men slapped their knees, women covered their mouths while giggling. Some shook their heads, smiling cruelly. "A janitor," someone whispered loudly. "Ridiculous," another scoffed. "Does he even understand the question?" The janitor stood still, his broom in hand, while the storm of laughter surrounded him. He did not laugh back. He did not lower his head. His face was calm, his eyes steady, like a man who had carried heavier burdens than mockery. The Tycoon, however, did not laugh. He leaned forward on the podium, studying the janitor with sharp curiosity. There was something in that quiet posture that held his attention. "Enough," the Tycoon ordered, and instantly the room fell silent. His voice had that effect, people obeyed. He kept his gaze on the janitor. "I asked a question, and this man claims he has an answer. Should we not hear him before we dismiss him?" No one dared to speak against him. The janitor nodded once, slowly, but before he could speak, a tall man in a dark suit jumped up. He was a famous lawyer, known for winning impossible cases. His voice carried arrogance. "Sir," the lawyer said, "with all respect, are we truly to waste our time listening to a janitor? We, your guests, are the most educated minds. If none of us could answer, how could he?" Murmurs of agreement spread. The janitor lowered his eyes for a moment, not in shame, but in patience. He had been ignored all his life, this was nothing new. The Tycoon raised an eyebrow. "And yet, lawyer, you failed to answer. Shall we deny him his chance only because of the work he does?" The lawyer sat back down, his face burning red. The janitor finally lifted his voice. It was not loud, but it was steady. Sometimes, he said, wisdom does not wear fine clothes. Sometimes it wears dust and carries a broom. The words hung in the air like a quiet strike of thunder. A professor in the front row stood suddenly, pointing at the janitor. Nonsense, he barked. Wisdom belongs to study, to learning, to knowledge earned through years of discipline. What can a janitor know of questions that puzzle the greatest? The janitor turned his head slightly toward the professor. And yet, Professor, he said softly, all your books and years of learning could not give you the answer, could they? Gasps filled the hall. The professor's mouth opened, then closed. He sank back into his chair, defeated by a single simple sentence. The laughter had ended. The room was no longer amused. Now it was unsettled. The Tycoon allowed a small smile to touch his lips. He enjoyed the shift, the humiliation of the proud, the challenge of the weak rising against the strong. Still, his eyes remained sharp. Very well, he said. If you believe you have the answer, then speak it. But be warned, if your words fail me, if you waste my time, you will be remembered as the fool who thought himself wise. The janitor bowed his head slightly, then looked up with calm determination. I understand, sir. But just as he opened his mouth, another interruption came. This time it was a woman, the chief of a global corporation, her voice dripping with arrogance. Wait. Sir, forgive me, but surely you cannot let this man answer before us all. If he speaks and is wrong, it will make a mockery of this gathering. It will make a mockery of you. The Tycoon's eyes turned cold. Do you fear his answer, Madam Chief? Or do you fear being shown smaller than the man who cleans your floor? The woman's face turned pale. She said nothing more. The janitor stood there, silent, watching the powerful fight to keep him down. But he had faced worse battles, poverty, hunger, loss. Their words could not break him. Slowly, he stepped closer, until he stood just below the stage where the Tycoon towered above. His footsteps echoed in the grand hall, louder than the whispers, louder than the beating hearts of the crowd. The Tycoon leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Speak, he commanded. The janitor lifted his head. His eyes glowed with something deeper than pride, deeper than anger. It was the glow of truth carried for too long, waiting to be spoken. And yet, he did not answer immediately. Instead, he asked, Sir, may I first tell you a story? The Tycoon frowned. The hall erupted again in protest. A story? What trick is this? He avoids the question. But the janitor did not back down. He kept his eyes locked on the Tycoon. Sometimes, he said softly, the answer is hidden inside the story. The Tycoon studied him for a long moment. Then, with a wave of his hand, he silenced the protests. Very well. Tell your story. But remember, your story had better carry the answer I seek. The janitor nodded. He tightened his grip on the broom, and his voice grew steady, carrying across the hall. Years ago, he began, I was not a janitor. I had a family, a home, and dreams. I worked hard, but life has a way of testing us. I lost what I loved most. No amount of money could bring it back. No amount of power could fix it. No wisdom from books could heal it. I was left with nothing but my hands and my pain. The hall grew quiet. Even the proudest leaned forward to listen. The janitor continued. I learned something in those days, something I carry with me still. I learned there is one thing greater than money, stronger than power, deeper than knowledge. And it is the one thing your question points to. The Tycoon's eyes sharpened. For the first time, he looked almost nervous. The air in the hall grew heavy, pressing down on everyone's chest. What is it? The Tycoon demanded, his voice tight. The janitor took a breath, his lips parting to speak. But before he could finish, the heavy doors of the hall swung open with a crash. Guards rushed inside, whispering urgently to the Tycoon. The answer was held back once again. The hall erupted in chaos. And the janitor stood silent, waiting. The great hall had fallen into chaos after the guards entered. They whispered urgently to the Tycoon, their faces pale, their voices trembling. No one could hear the words, but everyone saw the Tycoon's jaw tighten, his eyes narrowing with irritation. Later, he hissed at the guards, waving them away. Not now. The heavy doors closed again, and silence crawled back into the room. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some were angry at the interruption. Others were relieved, hoping the janitor would be silenced forever. But the Tycoon was not a man who let questions go unanswered. He turned back to the janitor. His voice was sharp. You were about to speak. Finish what you began. No interruptions now. Tell me, what is the answer? The janitor stood still, his broom resting against his shoulder. His face was calm, but inside his heart beat like a drum. For years, no one had listened to him. For years, he had been invisible. And now, the richest, most powerful man in the city was demanding his words. He looked around the hall. Every face was turned toward him, faces of power, faces of arrogance, faces that had laughed at him only moments ago. He could feel their eyes pressing down on him, trying to crush him back into silence. But he did not break. Slowly, he took a breath, and then his voice filled the room. You asked what cannot be bought with wealth, the janitor said, what cannot be commanded with power, what cannot be solved with knowledge. Many have tried to answer you, but they were thinking of things too small. They thought of time, of truth, of respect. They are close, but not enough. The real answer is deeper. The Tycoon's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward, resting his chin on one hand. For once, he was listening carefully. The janitor continued. I have seen men with wealth greater than yours lose everything in a single moment. I have seen leaders who commanded armies fall to despair when they were alone. I have seen scholars who knew every book fail to understand their own hearts. And in all of this, I learned something that none of them could see. The room was frozen. Even the proudest were silent now. The janitor's voice grew stronger. The one thing no wealth can buy, no power can command, no knowledge can solve, is peace inside the heart. Gasps echoed across the hall. Some shook their heads. Others whispered to each other. A few laughed bitterly, dismissing it. But the Tycoon did not laugh. He did not mock. He sat very still, his eyes fixed on the janitor as though trying to read the truth inside him. The janitor lowered his eyes for a moment, then lifted them again, his voice softer now. I once had a family, he said. I once had love. I worked hard, thinking I could give them everything. But life took them from me. I tried to fight it with anger. I tried to bury it with work. Nothing helped. No money, no power, no knowledge could fill the hole that was left. Only when I accepted the pain, only when I made peace with it, only then could I breathe again. His words fell heavy on the hearts of the listeners. For the first time, many in that room felt small, as though their wealth and power were fragile glass compared to the janitor's quiet strength. The Tycoon's fingers tightened on the edge of the podium. For years he had built towers of steel, empires of wealth. He had crushed rivals, commanded thousands. But the janitor's words struck deeper than any rival's blow. He finally spoke, his voice low. Peace of the heart, he repeated. That is your answer? The janitor nodded. Yes, sir. Because everything else can be taken. Wealth can vanish. Power can be broken. Knowledge can fade. But if you do not have peace inside, you will never rest. And if you do have it, nothing in this world can truly defeat you. Silence followed. Heavy, unshakable silence. The room of powerful people shifted uneasily. They had come here believing they were untouchable, that their money and titles made them superior. Now, in front of them, a janitor with rough hands and tired eyes had given an answer none of them could. The Tycoon rose slowly from his chair. His eyes locked on the janitor, and for the first time that night, something changed in his face. The arrogance was gone. In its place was respect, reluctant, but real. You speak as though you have carried this truth for a long time, the Tycoon said. The janitor nodded. I have carried it because I had no choice. The Tycoon stepped down from the stage. The audience gasped. The most powerful man in the room was walking toward the janitor. His footsteps echoed against the marble floor. He stopped only a few feet away. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, one dressed in the finest suit money could buy, the other in a gray uniform stained with dust and work. And yet, in that moment, it was the janitor who seemed taller. The Tycoon finally spoke. You may be right, he said. His voice was softer now, no longer sharp steel but something closer to human. Peace of the heart is something I have never been able to buy. And perhaps that is why I still search for answers. The crowd whispered in shock. Never before had they seen the Tycoon admit weakness. Never before had they seen him lower his pride before anyone. The janitor lowered his broom slowly. He gave a small nod. Even the strongest need peace, sir. Without it, everything else feels empty. The Tycoon's eyes darkened. His lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment he looked as though he might speak again. But then, something strange happened. He turned away from the janitor and looked back at the crowd. Tell me, he demanded, his voice booming again, is this man wrong? No one answered. Not one of the leaders, the scholars, the wealthy dared to challenge the janitor's words. The Tycoon's voice grew louder. Can any of you prove him wrong? Can any of you say that wealth has given you peace? That power has given you rest? That knowledge has erased your pain? Still, silence. Heads lowered. Eyes dropped to the floor. The Tycoon turned back to the janitor. His expression was unreadable, a storm behind his eyes. You have given me the answer, he said finally. But you have also given me something else, doubt. The janitor tilted his head slightly. Doubt? Yes, the Tycoon said, his voice heavy. Because if peace of the heart is the one thing beyond wealth, beyond power, beyond knowledge, then I must ask myself, have I wasted my life chasing shadows? The hall trembled with the weight of his words. The most powerful man in the room, perhaps the most powerful in the world, was questioning everything he had built. The janitor stood quietly, his eyes calm. He did not answer. Some truths a man must face alone. And in that silence, something began to shift, not only in the Tycoon, but in everyone watching. The great hall was still in shock. The janitor's words had cut through pride and arrogance like a sharp blade. For the first time, the Tycoon himself stood unsure, shaken by a truth he could not buy or control. But there was something in the janitor's calm face, something in his quiet voice, that hinted at more. His words did not come from books or theories. They came from a place deeper, darker. The people could sense it. The Tycoon could feel it. And so, he asked the question that hung heavy in everyone's chest. Who are you? The Tycoon said. His voice was quieter now, almost human. You speak as though you have lived 100 lives. But you are only a janitor. Why should I believe you? Why should I trust your answer? The janitor lowered his broom. His eyes grew distant, as though he was staring not at the Tycoon, not at the hall, but at memories only he could see. For a long moment, he did not speak. The silence grew thick, pressing down on every soul in the room. And then, softly, he began. I was not always a janitor, he said. Gasps rose from the crowd. They leaned forward. Even those who had mocked him minutes ago now listened with hungry ears. The janitor's voice carried the weight of years. Once, I had a family. A wife who laughed like spring sunlight. A daughter who ran into my arms every evening. I worked in a factory then. Long hours, hard work, but I believed it was worth it. I wanted to give them a better life. I dreamed of saving enough to send my little girl to school, to buy a small home where she could play in the yard. His eyes softened with memory, but his voice shook slightly. But dreams are fragile. The hall held its breath. One winter night, the factory caught fire, he said. His voice was flat, but the pain in his words cut deeper than any scream. The alarms failed. The flames spread too fast. I was trapped inside, fighting to help my workers escape. By the time I staggered out, half burned and choking, my home was gone. The fire had reached the neighborhood before I could. My wife, my little girl, they never made it out. A sound spread across the hall, a low gasp, followed by silence so heavy it felt alive. Even the proudest lowered their heads. The janitor closed his eyes for a moment. I buried them with my own hands. After that, I had nothing. No home. No family. No reason. For years, I walked like a ghost. People offered words, but words did nothing. People offered money, but money could not bring back laughter. People told me to forget, but how does a man forget the faces he loved more than his own breath? His hands tightened on the broom. So I worked. I cleaned floors. I carried trash. I fixed broken lights. It was all I could do to keep moving, to keep breathing. Every night, I slept with emptiness beside me. And every morning, I rose again to sweep another floor. That is how I became invisible to the world. That is how I became the janitor you see today. The hall was silent. Even the richest men had tears shining in their eyes. The arrogance that once filled the air had been crushed under the weight of his story. The tycoon, for the first time in his life, looked ashamed. He had mocked this man with his silence, doubted him because of his work, dismissed him because of his clothes. But now, he realized this janitor had lived through a fire no wealth could quench, carried a grief no power could remove. And out of that pain, he had found a truth stronger than steel. The janitor lifted his head again. His eyes were not wet. His voice was not broken. He spoke with a quiet strength that made every person in the hall tremble. From that day, I learned, he said. Peace of the heart is not given, it is earned. It is carved from pain. It is built from loss. It is chosen, again and again, even when the world takes everything from you. That is why your wealth cannot buy it. That is why your power cannot command it. That is why your knowledge cannot solve it. Because it is not out there, sir, it is in here. He tapped his chest, right over his heart. The tycoon's lips parted, but no words came out. He had faced rivals, enemies, and kings. He had crushed men with contracts and destroyed nations with deals. But now, before this janitor, he felt like a child hearing truth for the first time. The janitor continued, softer now. You asked your question because you are restless. You have everything a man could want, but still you feel empty. I know that emptiness. I lived in it for years. And I tell you, until you find peace in your heart, nothing in this world will ever be enough. The words fell like stones into the silence. One of the scientists, a man who had mocked earlier, covered his face with his hands. The lawyer who had shouted against the janitor now sat with his eyes wet. The woman chief who had doubted him stared down at her polished shoes, ashamed. The room was broken open, its pride shattered. And yet, the janitor stood quietly, no pride in his voice, no victory in his eyes. He had not spoken to humiliate. He had spoken because truth demanded it. The tycoon lowered his gaze, his silver hair catching the dim light. His voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone had ever heard. You speak of peace, he said. But tell me, have you truly found it? After all you lost, after all you suffered, have you found peace in your heart? The janitor looked at him. His answer came not with words, but with a faint, tired smile. It was not the smile of a man who had forgotten his pain. It was the smile of a man who had learned to live with it, who had chosen to carry peace even when sorrow never left. And that smile said more than any words could. The tycoon felt his throat tighten. For the first time, he turned his face away so no one would see his eyes. The janitor bent slowly, picked up his broom again, and whispered, Peace is not the absence of pain, sir. It is the strength to live with it. The hall trembled with silence. And in that silence, the most powerful man in the room, perhaps the most powerful man in the nation, felt smaller than the janitor who swept his floors. The hall was so quiet it felt like even the walls were listening. The janitor's story, his pain, and his final words had torn through the pride of the people like lightning through the sky. And there he stood now, not as a man in a gray uniform, not as a servant with a broom, but as someone far greater, someone who had walked through fire, survived, and returned with a truth that no one else could touch. For a long time, the Tycoon said nothing. His silver hair shone faintly under the lights, his sharp eyes lowered to the floor. People watched him, waiting. He was the man who always had the final word. He was the man who never bowed, never yielded. But now, he looked small. At last, he raised his head and looked at the janitor. The arrogance that once filled his face was gone. His voice, when it came, was heavy but softer than the hall had ever heard. All my life, the Tycoon said slowly, I believed respect was earned by power. I believed it came from wealth, from achievements, from being greater than others. But tonight, you have shown me something I cannot ignore. Respect is not bought with money, nor taken with force. It is given freely, given to those who have walked through pain and still carry dignity in their steps. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some of them nodded in silence. Others looked down, ashamed of their own arrogance. The Tycoon stepped closer to the janitor. His polished shoes echoed against the marble floor, but the sound no longer carried power, it carried humility. He stopped in front of the janitor, looking him in the eyes. Tell me, he said, how did you survive? How did you keep standing when life crushed you? The janitor's voice was calm. By remembering what I lost with love, not with anger. By choosing to carry their memory, not the fire that took them. Every day, I rose because I knew if I did not keep going, then their story would end with ashes. I chose to live for them. The Tycoon's throat tightened. He turned slightly, looking back at the hall. Do you hear this man? He said, his voice rising. Do you see? He has no wealth, no title, no throne of power. Yet he stands taller than us all. Because he carries something we have forgotten, strength born of loss, wisdom born of pain, dignity that no coin can buy. The hall erupted in whispers. For the first time, the powerful men and women looked at the janitor not as a servant, but as something more, as a teacher, as a survivor, as a man whose words carried the weight of truth. The lawyer who had once mocked him stood slowly, his face pale. Sir, he said, bowing his head slightly toward the janitor, I spoke with arrogance. Forgive me. Your words cut deeper than all the laws I have studied. Then the professor rose, adjusting his glasses with trembling hands. I thought wisdom belonged only to books. But now I see it belongs to life. I was blind. Tonight, you opened my eyes. The woman chief, once dripping with pride, stood as well. Her voice cracked. I judged you because of your uniform. But you carry more honor than all my titles. For that, I bow to you. And slowly, one by one, the room full of leaders, scholars, and wealthy giants rose to their feet. Their heads lowered. Their voices fell into silence. And all of their respect, once given only to the Tycoon, shifted toward the janitor. It was a moment no one could have imagined. The man who had swept their floors, who had been invisible in their eyes, now stood as the one they all honored. The janitor's eyes lowered humbly. He shook his head slightly. I am no great man, he said softly. I am only someone who has suffered, like many others. The only difference is that I chose not to let my suffering end me. But the Tycoon raised a hand. No, he said firmly. You are greater than you believe. You are proof that respect cannot be taken, it must be earned. And you earned it not by wealth, not by power, but by living with truth. Tonight, you are the teacher, and we are the students. The crowd murmured in agreement. Something strange stirred in the hall, something no one had expected. The janitor, once mocked, was now the center of attention. But he did not stand taller, he did not bask in glory. He stood the same way he always had, humble, quiet, holding his broom as though it was enough. The Tycoon looked around at the people. All of you came here believing you were the brightest minds. You failed to answer my question. But this man, the one you laughed at, gave the answer none of you could. And why? Because true wisdom does not bow to arrogance. It is not locked inside books or measured in titles. It is carried in scars. It is carried in the hearts of those who have lived. The silence in the hall was heavy, but it was no longer the silence of arrogance, it was the silence of respect. The janitor finally spoke again, his voice low. Sir, respect is not about power or status. It is about truth. People may fear wealth, they may obey authority, they may admire knowledge, but they respect honesty, humility, and strength in the face of pain. That respect, once given, is more powerful than all your gold. The tycoon looked at him for a long moment. Then, to the shock of everyone in the hall, he did something no one had ever seen. He bowed his head. The most powerful man in the nation, the titan of industry, lowered his head in front of a janitor. Gasps filled the hall. Some covered their mouths. Some whispered in disbelief. Others felt tears in their eyes. For the first time, they saw that even the greatest could humble themselves before truth. The janitor blinked, surprised, but he did not step back. He simply stood still, broom in hand, as the tycoon whispered, Tonight, you have taught me. Tonight, you have earned what I could never buy, my respect. The room trembled with emotion. And in that moment, the janitor had risen higher than anyone in the hall, not because he sought greatness, but because greatness had been placed upon him by truth itself. The great hall had changed. Where once there had been arrogance and laughter, now there was silence filled with respect. Where once the people had seen a janitor as invisible, now they saw him as someone greater than any of them had ever been. The tycoon still stood with his head slightly bowed, a gesture no one had ever imagined. For years, he had been untouchable, too proud, too high above others. But tonight, before the man with the broom, even his pride had broken. Slowly, the tycoon raised his head again. His sharp eyes were not sharp anymore. They were softer, almost human. His voice carried no command, no arrogance. It carried only sincerity. You have given me something I never thought I would find, the tycoon said. Peace is not in power, nor in wealth, nor in control. Tonight, you showed me that. But tell me one last thing, what should I do now? The hall leaned forward. Everyone wanted to hear the answer. This was no longer the tycoon's question. It had become their question too. The janitor looked around the room. His gaze moved slowly over the faces of scholars, leaders, lawyers, chiefs, and workers. His eyes were calm but piercing, as though he could see the emptiness hiding behind their titles. Finally, he spoke. You want to know what to do, he said softly. Then listen. Respect life. Respect people. Respect the small things you take for granted. Power without respect is nothing but fear. Wealth without respect is nothing but greed. Knowledge without respect is nothing but arrogance. If you want peace, then learn respect not just for yourself, but for others, even those you believe are beneath you. His words hung heavy in the air. The professor shifted uncomfortably. The lawyer swallowed hard. The woman chief pressed her lips together. Each one of them felt the truth strike deep. The janitor continued, his voice steady. I clean floors every day. People walk over them without noticing. That is fine. But I learned something from that work. If the floor is not respected, if it is ignored, it gathers dust. That dust spreads, and soon even the richest hall looks dirty. People are the same. When you ignore them, when you treat them as invisible, their pain grows like dust. And one day, it covers everything, even your wealth, even your pride. The hall was silent. The janitor's eyes softened. Respect is the only thing that lifts people. It costs nothing, but it is worth more than all your gold. It builds bridges where walls stand. It heals wounds that money cannot. It gives peace when nothing else can. That, sir, he looked at the tycoon, is the final lesson. The tycoon's lips trembled. He had faced rivals, defeated governments, and crushed enemies, but never had he felt so small and so alive at the same time. He whispered, respect is peace. The janitor nodded once. And then, something extraordinary happened. The tycoon turned to the crowd. He straightened his back, his voice rising so all could hear. Tonight, a man you all called just a janitor has shown us what none of us could. He has taught us that greatness is not measured in gold or power, it is measured in respect. From this day, I will not lead with pride. I will not build with arrogance. I will begin with respect. The words rang like thunder through the hall. The lawyer stood again. And so will I, he said firmly. I will treat those I once dismissed with the honor they deserve. The professor lifted his head. I will teach my students not only knowledge, but humility. The woman chief spoke next, her voice clear. I will remember that leadership is not about being above others, it is about respecting those I serve. And soon, voice after voice rose, each one vowing to change. The hall that had once been filled with pride was now filled with promises of humility and respect. The janitor listened quietly, his hands resting on the broom. He did not smile widely, he did not stand taller. He simply nodded, because he knew promises were only the beginning. But he also knew that the seed had been planted. At last, the Tycoon turned back to him. You have given me more than wisdom, he said. You have given me a path forward. And though I once mocked you, tonight I honor you. I ask you this, will you allow me to call you, my teacher? The hall gasped. The Tycoon, the most powerful man in the nation, asking a janitor to be his teacher? The janitor shook his head gently. His voice was soft but firm. I am not your teacher, sir. Life is your teacher. Pain is your teacher. I am only a man who listened. If you truly wish to learn, then listen too. The Tycoon bowed his head again. Then tonight, I begin listening. The hall erupted, not with laughter, not with arrogance, but with applause. Hands clapped together, not for wealth, not for power, but for truth. The sound was thunderous, echoing against the walls, shaking the very air. And yet, in the middle of it, the janitor stood quietly, holding his broom, unchanged. For respect had never been his goal. It had simply been his way of living. As the night ended, people left the hall with changed hearts. The lawyer walked with his head lower than before. The professor carried his books like they weighed more. The woman chief walked slower, thinking deeply. And the Tycoon, once untouchable, walked out as a man who finally understood humility. But the janitor? He stayed behind. He picked up a piece of trash from the floor, swept the corner, and cleaned the hall just as he always did. Because for him, greatness was never in the applause. It was in the quiet dignity of doing what was right, even when no one was watching. Outside, the night was calm. The stars shone above, silent witnesses to the lesson given inside. And somewhere in the stillness, it felt as though the laughter of a child and the warmth of a wife's smile lingered in the air, proud of the man who had turned his grief into light for others. And so, the janitor's final lesson remained, not carved in books, not written on walls, but carried in the hearts of those who had heard him. Respect. That was the answer. That was the peace.